Well, the U.S.-China relationship is really critical to both countries. It's probably the most difficult and in many ways the most important strategic relationship that the United States has, bilateral relationship that the United States has right now. Given the combination of China's rapid growth, its acquisition of increasingly significant military capabilities, its growing global economic presence, its growing involvement in a whole range of multilateral organizations, its production, along with the United States, of greenhouse gases and other elements that contribute to global pollution, global warming, its sheer size, scope. It makes it a real, and of course the fact that it's not a democratic country, that there's a long history of ups and downs in U.S.-China relations. The two countries have fought one another. The two countries have been strategic partners, as described, for a brief period of time before that term fell out of use. It's a complex relationship and one that's increasingly important, and the United States really has to get right to address a whole range of issues of relevance to the U.S., not just international, but domestic as well. China is now acquiring capabilities that conceivably can check or call into doubt, at least, if not neutralize, some of these historic U.S. capabilities. And it's doing it for logical national security reasons of its own, not because it's preparing to attack the United States or preparing to take over the Pacific and become the dominant power in the Pacific, necessarily. But because it wants to reduce its vulnerability to potential efforts to possibly contain or control or prevent Chinese access to key resources and to prevent the succession, or the separation, I should say, of Taiwan permanently from China. I mean, this effort began with the Taiwan issue for the Chinese. That's what really gave impetus towards their military modernization, even though they needed to modernize in general anyway, because they had a very backward military. But in any event, this effort to reduce vulnerability on the part of the Chinese and the effort of the United States to maintain predominance in the Western Pacific for historical reasons and what it views as essential geostrategic reasons, these two dynamics are potentially running up against each other. In fact, not potentially, they are running up against each other. And the question really becomes how the two countries will manage that kind of strategic shift that's occurring in the Western Pacific. And I want to emphasize, this is a problem that is essentially about the Western Pacific. It's not a problem about the Chinese creating a global military force that will be able to intervene across the world to support Chinese interests. In the Middle East, in Africa, in the Americas, that is highly unlikely that the Chinese will acquire either the capability or the desire to conduct such military actions. From a very basic perspective, I don't think Washington can really alter what has been its existing strategy since the normalization of relations between the U.S. and China back in 1979, or diplomatic relations established at that time. And that has been a combination of efforts to seek greater cooperation with China, to work with China to have China become a more significant and more supportive member of the international system as it becomes more involved beyond its borders in a variety of different ways, and encourage that effort, work with the Chinese to play a positive role throughout the world in a variety of areas, and yet on the other hand, maintain the capability to shape, to deter, and if necessary, to defeat Chinese ambitions if they were to become a threat to U.S. interests. And here primarily, the biggest concern has been, again, about Taiwan. and the desire to deter Chinese use of force against Taiwan or coercion against Taiwan that is clearly not in U.S. interests, and in the U.S. view, not in the interests of the region. So you've got this balance between, if you will, sort of cooperative engagement on the one side and shaping and deterrence on the other, which some people call hedging. Hedging for uncertainty, hedging towards uncertainty, hedging towards a possibility of a much more negative relationship with the Chinese. Given the uncertainties of China's trajectory in the future, given the fact that China is not a democratic state, given the fact that you have a lot of strategic distrust between U.S. and Chinese peoples and leaders, despite their desire for cooperation, you really have to have this kind of continued two-sided approach to dealing with China. It's not really a strategy per se, but it's approach. It's the sort of tools of strategy. Now, that said, I do think that in going forward, the United States needs to reassess some of its approaches, some of its policies that could enhance the engagement and cooperation side and minimize or lower the chances that the hedging or the deterrence side would come into play over time. Some people think the best way to do this is just simply to draw a line in the sand, build a strong U.S. military, counter every move the Chinese might possibly want to make militarily beyond their borders, neutralize any capability by the Chinese to deploy any forces that would question the U.S. predominance, and just make it clear to the Chinese that the U.S. will remain unambiguously dominant. I think this is an unrealistic strategy. I think well, let me rephrase that. I think it needs to be reassessed, that kind of an assumption, because I'm not sure that that kind of an approach would be the most effective, in dealing with the Chinese and trying to get where the U.S. wants to go, which is to have a genuinely sustained cooperative relationship with the Chinese. Secondly, I'm not sure that the United States is capable over the long term to maintain that kind of predominance if China continues to grow at the rate of growth that it is experiencing now. And there's a big debate about that, whether or not China will continue to grow as fast as it has been over the last 20 years. But if the U.S. is not able to maintain its growth and able to maintain the commitment of resources to the region, it will be questionable whether or not it can indeed sustain its predominance. So that, I think, is problematic. And as time passes, I think that there needs to be more attention given to alternative ways of structuring security in the region, or at least ancillary ways, additional ways that go beyond the standard, what's called hub and spoke system of the U.S. alliance-based system with key allies in the region, a forward military presence, and all of what that means. In the context of China's rise and emergence, I think there needs to be a greater effort to try to engage with China, and China needs to do this as well, of course, in a range of more multilateral interactions that include the Chinese, that have security dimensions to them, regional security dimensions to them. Not necessarily hard security, what you call hard security to begin with at least, but with the idea of possibly moving in that direction, to get the militaries to interact more with one another, to have more contact, not just between the U.S. and China, but the U.S., China, and other Asian militaries about the future of the region and what's necessary to avoid rivalry over time. That really needs to be examined more closely, and I think the U.S. needs to make some hard decisions about what it's willing to do on these different fronts. I'm not so sure, as many people seem to be, that this situation regarding Taiwan will remain as generally benign and stable as it appears to be today. If we see China continuing to grow at double-digit rates, if we see China continuing to apply its resources to acquiring much greater military capabilities to deal with the Taiwan environment, the Taiwan situation or Taiwan contingency, it will become unclear to me whether China will continue to sort of accept continued significant U.S. arms sales to Taiwan in response to China's military buildup without seeking to place greater coercive pressure on the United States and possibly on Taiwan, which could indeed produce crises between the U.S. and China over time. I take China's perspective on Taiwan and its commitment to resolving this issue in its favor as something that is a very serious national security objective for the Chinese. It's not necessarily one we need to accept as the Chinese define it, but I'm not sure it can be managed successfully with the standard kind of approach that the U.S. has taken in the past, which is we don't get involved in cross-strait dialogues between Taipei and Beijing. We just sell arms through an independent, autonomous assessment of what we think Taiwan might need. We don't talk to the Chinese about it. We don't interact with them about it. I think over time that kind of a strategy could become increasingly difficult to manage in terms of managing its impact on U.S.-China relations. And it calls for consideration, in my view, of thinking about how the U.S. and China might be able to engage in some kind of dialogue to understand or establish some sort of quid pro quos involving military deployments and arms sales in consultation with the Taiwan government on the U.S. side. But it would require a lot of very different thinking on the part of U.S. officials from what exists today, because the U.S. position basically today is it's not broken, don't fix it. We just keep selling arms to Taiwan if the Chinese keep developing. And that to me is, if trends continue, that is a recipe for problems. The U.S. has a somewhat mixed record in this regard. I think on the positive side, the U.S. has made it clear that it is concerned about the peaceful resolution of these territorial disputes, whether they be in the East China Sea between China and Japan, whether they be in the South China Sea involving many Southeast Asian countries and China, or in other parts of the region. The U.S., again, as a major regional player, a predominant maritime power, concerned with freedom of the seas, concerned with peaceful resolution of conflicts, has weighed in on this in a significant way. And I think that is important. I think it's important for all the countries in the region to see this. It's important to reassure allies, and it's important to caution those who would seek to resort to coercion or worse to resolve some of these issues. Now, that said, I think the U.S. Unintentionally has communicated the message to the Chinese, and perhaps to other countries as well, that it appears to be taking sides in this effort. It appears to be coming down on the side of the Southeast Asian countries, those members of ASEAN that have disputes with China on territorial issues. And to some degree, it's seen as coming down on the side of the Japanese in its quarrel with China over territorial disputes. This, I think, as I said, was unintentional. I don't think that there was a clear desire to draw a line in the sand and tell the Chinese that the U.S. is on the side of these other countries in its disputes. But the Chinese have, by and large, drawn that conclusion. And they see this as part, therefore, of a larger strategic calculation that the United States has made to use these disputes as ways of increasing U.S. presence, leverage, and support for the U.S. position in the Western Pacific. And that, of course, is not something that the Chinese look on very favorably. They want to see a more even-handed, neutral position on the part of the United States, which the U.S. professes to have, but its actions have not conveyed that in the view of the Chinese. over time, analysts are discovering that the Chinese and the United States certainly have a common commitment to avoiding conflict on the Korean Peninsula, avoiding instability on the peninsula, and making the peninsula a nuclear-free area, not having nuclear weapons on the peninsula or the export of nuclear weapons or technology from the peninsula. I think the goals there are quite similar. However, there is a significant difference between the two countries in their perception of how do you get to those endpoints. What kind of strategy is most useful? And in that regard, this issue of strategic distrust, particularly on the Chinese side, I think exists. The Chinese have a strong suspicion that from the US point of view, the best solution is to overturn the regime in North Korea, to create regime change, in other words, that would eliminate the problem. The Chinese have clearly indicated they don't want that. That's not to say they're in support of the North Korean government in whatever it does. They're not, or they're in support of the existence of the North Korean regime infinitely into the future. They are not necessarily. But it does suggest that they are very hesitant to join in efforts that focus all the other players involved in this issue against North Korea. They want to keep the door open to North Korea. They want to keep North Korea as a viable regime, and they want to have the problems involved worked through peacefully without North Korea or the United States provoking greater confrontation. And how you do that and what role you play in doing that can differ significantly between China and the United States, and it has, and it will continue to do so. I don't see a major change in the way the Chinese behave towards North Korea and U.S. policy towards North Korea, certainly in the near term. North Korea is going through a critical succession process now. I think the Chinese are looking at the long term. They're looking for a post-Kim regime. They're hoping that there will be other elements within North Korea which could emerge to become more moderate in some ways, more receptive to the kind of reform policies that China has undertaken, and therefore peacefully evolve to a position of greater stability for the region. So it doesn't want to resort to efforts that could derail that kind of a possibility. And the United States, I think, is not necessarily as, I wouldn't say sanguine, but not necessarily as long-term in that point of view. It looks towards addressing the question of denuclearization and addressing the question of really making sure that the North Korean regime stops undertaking actions that are highly provocative against South Korea. And that dynamic is going to continue. I don't think it's known at this point, in all honesty, what the new leadership in China is going to do that would be different from what it has done in the past. The apparent successors to the current leadership at the top, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, are in many ways kind of ciphers as figures in terms of their foreign policy and their preferences, what they would or would not support. So, and there's going to be a big turnover in the party leadership at the party Congress next year. Something like 70% or more of leadership positions will turn over, and many leaders at the higher levels retiring. So there's a whole new crop of individuals coming in. What their views are, we cannot really say at this point. However, there certainly are certain trends that appear to be underway that one should keep an eye on. One of them is the level and degree of reform, economic reform in China. Many analysts believe China is entering a kind of threshold point or a watershed point, however you want to describe it, that It's going to have to engage in certain much deeper levels of reform, particularly financial reform, in order to maintain adequate growth rates that will retain the prospect of domestic stability, social stability, and order. And they'll have to make some significant changes in other policies on internal migration, residence certificates, that sort of thing, that if they don't do, they could end up really losing a lot of their growth rate, and you could have a lot of problems as a result of that. How the leadership, the new leadership, responds to these challenges, and they certainly are challenges, will be one very strong bellwether. Second will be how they deal with domestic dissent. China's communications revolution has been very, very significant over the last 20 years. The ability of Chinese citizens to communicate with each other, the ability of them to communicate with the outside world, using advanced technologies of various types, has, of course, come up against the desire of the government to control that information flow, or those elements of the flow that might threaten the government. And yet what we've seen on the outside now with the Arab Spring and recent developments is that these technologies in these societies are being used to generate or strengthen social movements in the societies. The Chinese government certainly does not want that to happen. And so it has a major challenge in dealing with that. It's responded to that really by and large, enacting repressive policies, constraining policies on the technology side to try and filter out these kinds of capabilities of interacting, and engaging in enhanced levels of repression domestically against individuals and groups that might want to act more autonomously, either through these technologies or independently. And this is a very worrisome development within China. The Chinese government seems to have made a conclusion, drawn a conclusion that in order to avoid what has been happening in the Middle East, which it sees as, to a great extent, as destabilizing, as creating a lot of chaos, in order to avoid that kind of rupture in social fabric and abrupt shifts in political and social relations, it wants to nip any movements in the bud. It wants to really go after any kind of possible basis for protest or criticism very early on. The lesson it seems to have drawn is if you don't do that, if you don't do it effectively, you're in trouble. Now, the Chinese, of course, have got a very strong thing going for them, and that is their growth, their economy. They are not in the same socioeconomic situation as Tunisia or Egypt or Libya. They're much better off, at least from Egypt and Libya. And so they have still, I think, a lot of popular support in a variety of areas. And they play very much to the fear of chaos that exists in China, given its historical legacy in the modern period.